Hey everybody, สวัสดีครับ Welcome to Beer Times Story, the platform where beer and brewing knowledge is shared. For today's sessions, we're gonna have a good burp about behind the curtain of unfamiliar beer styles. Now, according to BJCP 2021 style guidelines, there are roughly about 100 recognized beer styles to this day. Of all this number, there are a few that would normally ring people's bells, like IPA, Pale Ale, Stout, Hefeweizen, Pilsner, and to some extent, Lager as a general term. However, we are going to bungee jump into the opposite end of this spectrum. We are going to explore those styles that are almost forgotten, styles that some of them are pretty difficult to pronounce, to be honest. And I'm here with the one of the Forefront Explorer. He is the co-author of Barley Wine book, as well as an author of Goza book, the man behind Delicious Brew from Boonview, the brewmaster of Anderson Valley Brewing Company. Please welcome our guest speaker, Val Allen.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you now.
Yeah, good to see you. Good to see you. It's been a while, and welcome to our platform, Val.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And here you look young and happy.
I'm happy.
Yeah, and young.
I don't know about the young.
I'll just give you that.
The beer is keeping me young.
Yeah, that's the secret to all of you, brewmaster. So what's up in Boonville? Like, you still rocking the brewery 24/7?
I don't know about 24/7, but we're still making a lot of beer. We
Mm-hmm.
have made some new beers lately. About 3 years ago, I decided I wanted to make a series of beers that I had never brewed before.
Mm-hmm.
So I started making beers that certainly will fall into today's category of unusual beers. Some of these beers I'd heard of, some of them I'd never heard of, and some of them are new styles that I don't think existed more than just a few years ago. So I've had a lot of fun over the last 3 years experimenting with different processes and different ingredients, and it's kind of really invigorated my joy of brewing. So it's been nice.
Yeah. Like a few years back, like what you mentioned about the last 3 years, right? Because I believe that I saw you start experimenting, working on these unusual or unfamiliar styles in small scales. And given the fact that the cash cow for Anderson Valley is Goza, I still find that you are super interested in brewing, this unfamiliar style and having fun at the same time. It's like it's reignites your, inner young brewer spirits,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
I think that's experimentation keeps your job interesting, and when you're
Mhm.
a brewer, there is a lot of repetitive things. Like you were saying, the the beer that brings us the most money is Goza or our
Mhm.
Bunt Amber, and we brewed literally thousands of batches of Bunt Amber, and certainly at least hundreds, many hundreds of Gozas. So it gets repetitive if that's all you do. So it's good to bring in new beers, try things that are interesting and different. And I think the brewers enjoy doing it. I know I enjoy doing it, and everybody enjoys drinking them at the pub. So it's a win for everybody.
Right. That's great. That's great. Okay, so let's begin the session by this question, Val. Like, give us an examples of name of the beer style that would consider to be the unfamiliar. That would consider to be in the unfamiliar camp.
Well, there's quite a few. Lichtenheiner is a beer that very few people have ever heard of.
Hmm.
Grodziskie
Hmm.
is a Polish beer that is smoky, um, made with 100% smoked oat malt. A lot of people have never had a Steinbier, which is a German style made with hot rocks. Uh, there is the Kreut beer, which I think I'm pronouncing it wrong, but that's how it looks to me. That's a Dutch style that's made mostly with oats.
Mhm.
Uh, Berliner Weiss is one that's a little more well known, but not many people have actually had a real Berliner Weiss, because up until craft brewing started making them again, nobody really made them. Not even in Germany. There are very few. There are some Berliner Weiss breweries in Germany now making excellent uh, Berliner Weiss. Schnuel uh, makes a very nice one. Quite a few of them do. And then there's Sati, which is, again, kind of a maybe not unheard of style, but very few people have had one, a real Sati, and very few people have brewed one. So it's been a real kind of interesting trip to find out about each of these beer styles and then try and brew them. And I found out a few more on the way. We just made a Koji rice lager, which when you say rice lager, most people are like, oh, that's like Budweiser or a Japanese brand of lager. But Koji is a special rice that's treated with a mold, and then after the mold does its work on it, it's used to make sake usually. So we've taken some of this Koji rice that has been mixed with this mold and allowed to ferment on its own, and now we're using it in brewing. So you're getting this very interesting flavor of a hybrid between a sake and a beer. So that's been a real fun one. We recently made a dark beer that is a light beer, so we're
Right.
calling it Black Light, but there aren't very many beers like this out there in the world. It's 3.8%, 95 calories, and yet it's dark with flavor. So people are very confused by this beer, and it does seem to be catching some traction.
Right, right. That's awesome. And this is just like, a few example of this unfamiliar beer style. There are tons of it more out there, and all of them looks and sounds delicious. The second one is like, in your opinion, what makes them unfamiliar to, from today's drinker?
Well, the whole world went through a an interesting kind of beer progression, I'll call it, where there used to be beer styles for every little region, or even every little town had their own style of beer. And sometimes they'd be very similar, one town to the next one over, but sometimes they were very different. And this was true, I think, throughout the world. Anywhere that they were making alcoholic beverages with grains, you would find that each region had its own kind of specialty or their own way of doing it. And when I was down in Indonesia, they make a beer from palm sugar, and palm trees are technically a grass, so that's sort of like a beer. And each district or region I went to had a different way of doing it, so they tasted different. So I think, throughout the world, but particularly in Europe where beer was really strong, each little town, each little region had its own beer style. And then as commerce expanded out, certain styles were more sought after, or consumed more, or purchased more, or sold more further afield. So those styles kind of would drown out some of the local flavor. And over time, light lager became the beer that took over most of the sales. So you find light lager in every country in the world. Probably every country that I know of or have ever been to has their own brewery, and they make some sort of light lager. And probably once upon a time, there was another type of alcoholic beverage or beer made in that area, but it just got taken over by light lager. And you see that in South America for sure, and Africa. And they used to make sorghum beers in Africa, but those are not very common anymore. So you see the light lager everywhere. And in the 1960s, that kind of reached a peak. And then people kind of began to push back. I think it started, mostly in Britain, but I think Belgium had kept a few of their regional brands and styles, and Germany had kept a few of theirs. And, some of the other countries had smaller, amounts of smaller breweries making these different styles. But by and large, after, they got pushed out, it was hard for them to come back. And so when the craft beer movement started in the 70s in Britain and then in America, brewers began to look around for different beers because, as we were talking a little earlier, that it keeps it interesting for the brewers to make something different. So they would start to find new styles, mostly historic, some of them still existing, but some of them that didn't even exist anymore, and they would try and brew them. So I think some of these that we talked about were extinct, and some of them were still made, but only by maybe one or two breweries in the world. And it's been interesting to see craft brewers throughout the world, read about these styles, rediscover them, and then start making their interpretations of them.
Right. Thanks for the answer. It is understood. So, to me, I think that the main contributor that drive these styles away from people are probably like a combination of the embracement of kind of industrialization, modernization, and perhaps like the change of people palettes that were somehow shaped by the society, and leaving this brew this unfamiliar style of beer behind. And if not, like what you said, if not with the attempt from some of the brewers like you, that just try to brew and explore and experiment, bringing this style back to the current world, it may be lost over time. So I have to thank you for that. Yeah,
Well,
and
it's my pleasure. But it's a good point. Some of these beers, like Goza, for example, it went almost extinct several times. And doing my research for the book, it was very interesting because in modern times, people would take notes about flavor, and I say modern, like the last 100 years or so, maybe 200. But
yeah,
for beers that were made prior to that, there weren't a lot of written notes about what a beer tasted like. So you are left with the name of the beer, and that usually has something to do with the region or the town. And then you have to see if you can find recipes and suss out how the beer might have tasted from that. And these recipes can be quite different because they don't use pounds or kilograms or liters. They use these measurements that we're unfamiliar with, yards or bales, or so you have to go back and find out how that relates to today's measurements to even determine what the recipes are like. So it can be very difficult.
yeah, true. Okay. Let's just adjust the mood and tone of the conversation a bit to the brighter side. Let's talk about the six styles that you just gave us an example, right? I'm eager to know about the unique characteristic of each one in terms of its appearance, flavor profiles, as well as the unique brewing practice if it's applied. So please briefly walk us through them one by one. Let's start with the Dutch style cut beer from Netherlands.
Yeah, that's an unusual beer, and not a lot of people make it anymore. So it's very hard to determine what that beer would be like. It was very, very popular once upon a time, and it has a very high percentage of oats in it, and that's kind of its hallmark. And you got to take into consideration what technology people were able to use when that beer was popular. So the Kuyt beer, or however it's pronounced,
It's all right.
the Flemish do a lot of sounds. So I think it's Kuyt or Kuya. I don't know. But
it works out.
Yeah. So to do the research, you have to find, a recipe and go back into books and read about what people said about it and see if you can find, some tasting notes, if any, or people would, sometimes talk about why they liked it. And then you've got to, try and determine how you want to move forward. There wasn't a lot of really pale colored malt being made 300 years ago and further back. So beers that were made prior to, 200 or 300 years ago were often, a little bit darker. They didn't have the same technology to kiln the malt or dry the malt without adding some color to it. And there's some debate among brewers as to whether the process of kilning and drying that malt would also be done, under some sort of fire, and would that have added a smoky character? Some people say yes, some people say no. I tend to believe that it depends on how far back in history you go. At some point, certainly, most beers were probably smoky, dark, and sour. But if you're talking about 600, 700 years ago, most people were smoky and sour smelling. So I don't know if you'd notice that in your beer.
Maybe not, but
Yeah. So when we made the Coit beer, we wanted to stay as traditional as possible, but it was going to be difficult. So we used a large percentage of oats, and we fermented it with a yeast from the Netherlands, from the area that beer had come from. And we tried to use hops from that area as well. So those are kind of the ways that we attempted to recreate this beer. And since I'd never had one, except for, from other craft brewers or home brewers who'd probably never had one, it's a little bit of a mystery. So, you find a recipe and then you try and stick to as close to that as you possibly can and produce a beer that you think represents the historical style.
right. And you say that for the malt bill, the leading chart is oat, right? It's oat malt.
Yes.
And they're going to be a bit of the mixture between like wheat malt and malted barley, like a pale color one.
Yeah, but I think there was definitely some color to this beer. I mean, the picture that you have up there now is dark. It's a little darker than the beer we made. Ours was a little lighter than that. We didn't use any dark malt per se, but we used malt that was not. It was kilned a little higher temperature than Pilsner or Pale Ale malt, so it brought some color to it. Oats were considered in some regions to be a cheaper grain to use to make beer. So more common beers for the masses were often made with oats. So it was considered to be maybe not the best ingredient, but here's a beer that has, as much as 50% of the total charge being oats. So, and it was very popular. It sold very well during its time. There's the one thing that, you can find records on is taxes. So you can see what was popular and what was not and what was selling. So it was a very popular beer for a while. And it's interesting to think that those two things kind of are juxtaposed. Very popular, and yet in some regions, certainly being made with oats made it seem, a little not as classy.
Right. So you mentioned that you used the yeast from Netherlands. Is that an ale strain or a lager strain?
Yeah, it was an ale strain. I think most of these beers were probably ales. There's a couple exceptions in here. The German styles, the Steinbier is a lager. But I think mostly people were using ale strains because they were so much easier to work with. And you have to remember that 200 years ago, people didn't fully understand what yeast was. They knew there was this stuff that they took from one batch and put into another, and that made it beer. But they didn't understand that there was actually a microorganism in there. So they were often selecting for what was, from the previous batch and what was easy. So lager brewing didn't really come about until relatively recently. If humans have been making beer for somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years, lager brewing has just been at the very tail end of it.
Yeah, pretty relatively young styles of beer that we are talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And so this gut beer, do you find that the excessive use to say of oat malt contribute to a certain unique characteristic in terms of taste and flavor? The
Yeah, absolutely.
variability.
So we use oats in our oatmeal stout, for example, to give it mouthfeel and
Right.
fullness, but we
Mhm,
only use about 10%.
mhm,
And when you take that level up that much higher to 40 or 50 or 60%, then you have
mhm,
other characteristics in the oats that are going to come forward. And we found that the oats brought a kind of interesting kind of breadiness, kind of like rye bread almost note to it. And it was also very sharp. And we expected that the oats to bring a lot of that fullness, and maybe the beer wouldn't ferment as well because there were too many complex, carbohydrates or sugars in there. But that's not what we found. The beer fermented very well and dried out quite a bit. And there was some of that richness that the oats bring to an oatmeal stout. But at the same time, it wasn't as much as we thought. And so the
mhm.
beer had a high drinkability to it. It wasn't really full. It was actually a rather dry beer, and people drank a lot more of it than I expected them to.
Wow, it sounds, you just discover like an unexpected outcome from
Yes.
this style of beer, right? Yeah. And to be honest, like I myself haven't heard about this style of beer before I start talking to you about it, about this session. So it is a very interesting one.
Yeah, a lot of these beers, I went through the Brewers Association guidelines for the World Beer Cup,
Hmm.
and kind of pulled them out of that, thinking, oh, I've never had one of those, or I've never brewed one of those.
Hmm.
So that's where some of these beers came from. Um, I can't remember if the Keup beer is in there or not. It is a pretty unusual style.
Right, right. I agree on that 100%.
But as we go down this list, things are going to get weird. Okay.
Right.
So
Things gonna get wild.
this is a relatively straightforward beer. We did it in a mash tun like a
Hmm.
normal beer. We boiled it like a normal beer. We used hops. We pitched yeast. It was all fairly normal. As we go
Right.
on, they're going to get weird.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Okay, so next is Berliner Weiss, which comes with the nickname Champagne of the North during Napoleon time from around Berlin area in Germany. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, this is a very interesting beer, and it survived through a much longer. Its history is quite long, probably not quite as long as Goza or a couple of these others that we'll talk about, like Sati. But it
Mhm.
has a long history, probably 700 or 800 years. This beer has been brewed, and it was originally, and native to the area in and around Berlin in Germany, and it is a sour wheat beer, not
Mhm.
unlike Goza. The main difference is Goza has a little salinity to it, some saltiness, and a little bit of coriander, where the Berliner Weisse doesn't. It's just a straight sour wheat beer, and
Mhm.
it it has a lot of interesting things it shares with Goza. So back 700 or 800 years ago, there were really just two types of beer. There were variations on these two, but there were just two types, and those were lighter wheat beers,
Mhm.
sort of like the one in the picture here, or darker brown beers.
Right.
And the brown beers were highly alcoholic. They didn't use hops at all, or in very, very little amounts. They used other herbs and spices to spice their beer with. Um, and so hops have a natural antimicrobial property to them that works quite well. And it also balances the beer. But when you're making beer to last more than just a few days or weeks, then you're going to have an antimicrobial component of it, which is going to have to be alcohol. So the brown beers were all, minimum of like 6% and up to, 9, 10%.
Yeah.
So they're very strong, and you couldn't just have like 3 of them and then go do anything. You know,
Mhm.
3 8% beers, and you're not going to go mow the lawn or, you know, till the field or whatever they did 700 years ago.
Mhm.
You know, you're going to be kind of smashed. So the alternative to those were these lighter wheat beers, but they didn't have very much alcohol in them, and they went sour very quickly. So
Mhm.
they were meant to be consumed literally within 3 or 4 days of brewing. And if they didn't get consumed quite quickly, they became sour. And some people grew to like that sour flavor. And so there are instances of those beers being stored longer. Um, but you really either had the lighter alcohol wheat beers or the heavy, you know, brown beers. So
Mhm.
the Berliner Weiss falls solidly into that, you know, the lighter wheat beer style that's sour. And it's soured by multiple bacteria. The first is a lactic acid bacteria that's very quick acting, and it's used in all kinds of food production all over the world, in
Mhm.
kimchi, in sausages, in pickles, and it's used in yogurt and all kinds of products. And
Right.
so it's very well understood, even before people understood what was doing the process. They understood the process that, you
Mhm.
know, lactic acid bacteria would, you know, be used to make cheese and all kinds of things. So that part of it was well understood. Now, I was in Berlin a few years back doing some research for the Goza book and ran into a bunch of Berliner Weisse brewers, and they all insisted that there was a second component to this beer, that it was had a Brettanomyces, which is not a bacteria but a wild yeast. Uh, but they insisted
Mhm.
that that was a component of it. And so now most of the craft versions that you'll get have a little bit of that component in there. So
Interesting.
yeah, and Berliner Weisse, very interestingly, doesn't isn't fast acting. So I think, I'm sorry, not the Berliner Weisse,
Right.
the Brettanomyces is not
Yeah.
fast acting. So I think Berliner Weiss was made originally to be consumed very quickly, and that wasn't very quickly consumed got stored, usually in barrels or in
Mhm.
big, you know, wooden tanks. And the Brettanomyces lives in these barrels in these wooden tanks, and it would start to work on the beer. But it often took 3 to 6 months for that Brettanomyces to work through and make a beer that was, you know, kind of delicious to drink. There was a middle
Mhm.
section where it's not so delicious. So you can
Yeah.
drink it very young, or you can drink it in the middle where it's not very good, or you can wait, and then the Brettanomyces really does this magic to it and
Mhm.
makes it really floral and um, just fabulous. So we wanted to be as traditional as we could at the time, and so we did this beer without a lot of we brewed, you know, did the mash, ran off into the kettle, and I was still very nervous about the process. So we heated it up just to almost to boiling. And
Mhm.
then we didn't put any hops in it.
Mhm.
And we ran it off into wooden barrels and put in yeast, lactic acid bacteria, and Brettanomyces, all 3 at once. So we had a
Okay.
co-fermentation of all 3 of those. And you could see each one do its thing. But here they are in wooden wine barrels, which we stored out in a barn and
Okay.
just kind of let them go. And it was our first kind of experiment with this co-fermentation entirely in wood and with a minimal amount of heating of the wort before pitching, before cooling it and pitching. So it was very experimental, and I was very nervous, didn't know how it was going to turn out, but it took a little longer than I thought. I thought it'd be ready in about 3 months. It really took about 7 or 8 months for the beer to come around. And in that middle section, I thought we were just going to have to dump them all. They were all just terrible.
Right.
So, you know, it had this initial, you know, very tart acidity from the lactic acid bacteria, and then the yeast took over and made the alcohol. And in the end, the Brettanomyces came in and finished it up. It was a very
Right.
interesting beer, and I think we'll do that one again because it was pretty popular.
Nice. So, what can we expect from the taste of this Berliner Weiss?
Well, it's definitely going to be sour.
Hmm.
And then because it's a wheat beer, it definitely has some wheat flavor.
Hmm.
And then the Brettanomyces is going to come in, and if you know what that flavor is, you recognize it immediately.
Right.
It's some people describe it as like horse sweat,
Yeah.
which is a little bit of a
For sure.
rough description, but not far off. It's
Hmm.
very, outdoorsy, and it can have like a hint of phenolic, which is like lightly plasticky. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like this horse sweat combined with plastic, which I know doesn't sound good, but it
I
is.
know. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. But it's just like, like you just sprinkle some magic powder over the top of your dish. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Right.
there are
Hmm.
people who don't like that flavor. I get it.
Hmm.
And so for those people, they're just not going to like that beer. But there are lots of people who find it very appealing, and
Hmm.
it is a very interesting flavor. I particularly like it. So I love beers that are finished with Brett, but they just take a long time. They take anywhere from 3 to 9 months for that to work out, even longer sometimes.
Right. For the bread to kick in some of its good stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, this Berliner Weiss, it is like, an interesting style of beer. It has a very fascinating brewing practice, and from my finding and what you share, right, especially the use of unhopped wort and mix it with, in some case, like hopped water, and then ferment the wort with the mixture of multicultural organism. It sounds wild, but it works out, and it just gives this nicely champagne like crisp and interesting sour taste beer.
yeah. Most of those beers have the same acidity that a white wine does.
Hmm.
So they're not super sour, but they are acidic. And I think it got the Champagne of the North nickname from
Hmm.
Napoleon's troops, who,
Yes.
when they invaded that area, drank it. And at that time, it was being put into bottles and allowing to
Mhm.
re-ferment. So it had a really nice effervescence to it. And that, I think, that carbonation, the effervescence to it, makes for a very, very nice drink. So Berliner Weiss prepared that way, I think, is fabulous.
Right on. Right on. Okay. The next style is German Stein beer, which its name literally means stone beer, right?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk
So
about it.
this beer this is a tough beer to define for a couple reasons. Um, but as the name suggests, it's made with hot stones. It's made with stones. So it really depends on who you want to believe. Now, Michael Jackson was the
Not
first person,
not the singer, right?
no, not the singer, the beer
Okay.
writer,
All
who he's passed away now, sadly. Well, so they
right.
both have. But Michael Jackson, the beer writer,
Right. Hmm.
and for folks who'd like to see this, there's a video out there that he produced about this style of beer. He went to a brewery in Germany. He'd never heard of this either. So he went to this brewery in Germany who was still making it and looked at
Yeah.
their process. And everybody who ever watched that video, myself included, thought, well, that's the way to do it. It
Hmm.
turns out it's not the way to do it. That will come up later in our discussion.
All right.
But
Sure.
this particular brewery had its own kind of method, its own process for making Stein beer. And they were one of the few that were still around. It
Mhm.
turns out they had modified a traditional method to fit their process. So no one really knew the difference until more research was done. But this brewery, and I don't remember the name of the brewery, but it's in the Michael Jackson video.
Mhm.
They would take hot rocks, they would heat them up over a wood fire, and then they would, do a regular mash, run off into the kettle, and then they would add the hot rocks to get the wort boiling.
Mhm.
And they would have to heat them up a whole lot. And I think they used a cage to dump them um,
Oh.
into the kettle to heat it up. And it worked quite well. And they then took, after they boiled it and put the hops in and everything, they would cool the wort down and send it in and ferment. And then after fermentation, they would take these rocks that were covered with caramelized wort and put them into the conditioning tank. It's a complicated process, and it sounds dangerous, and it is.
Yeah.
So we did a modified version of their modified version.
Okay.
So we heated hot rocks up on an oak fire and got
Mhm.
them, smoky. Then we dropped them in to a barrel on the side of the kettle and recirced through the kettle and got it up to temperature that way, because we didn't want a lot of broken rocks stuck in our kettle later on. And we didn't take the rocks afterwards and put them into the conditioning tank for a whole bunch of reasons. So this was kind of a modified version of the Steinbier. And it turns out that our modified version on their modified version was really probably quite far from what really was being done in Germany, 400 or 500 years ago to make this style of beer. But it was an interesting experiment. I sent you some pictures of us heating up the rocks.
Right.
And it was a fun beer to do.
Mm-hmm. So this is the photos, right?
Yeah, and these photos, some of these are from when we did the Steinbier, but we used a similar process to heat the rocks up for another beer that we'll talk about in a few minutes, the Sati.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I took a 55-gallon drum, cut a hole in the bottom, as you can see in the middle picture, so we could put wood in there. And then I put a grate in above it so I could pile the rocks on top of it. And we heated up the rocks that way. And the rocks got red hot. They have to be, very hot. And we collected the rocks from our property. And it took me a while to figure out which ones were going to explode when you heated them up and which ones weren't. So it was a little, challenging. But we found a type of rock on the property that could stand being heated up and then put into the wort and cool down quickly without exploding. So we would heat them all up. We use these pickers that you can see up in the upper right-hand corner to pull them out and put them on a shovel. And then the shovel would dump them into the wort for the Steinbier. And when we did it differently for the Sati, which we heated the rocks the same way, but we used them differently in the process. So, yeah.
But you mentioned that there is another way of brewing this Steinbier that's not according to the late Michael Jackson video, right?
Yeah. You want to talk about that now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so we'll jump ahead to the Sati. Now, it turns out that Sati and Steinbier were probably brewed in very similar methods, 300-400 years ago, and even further back. Sati may be the oldest beer style in the world. It's hard to determine, but they've been brewing these beers in farms in the Norwegian, Norway, Sweden, in the Scandinavian area, and each farm literally has its own kind of process. They're all very different. But one thing they all kind of share is this method of heating up the rocks to use it to heat up, whatever portion of the beer you're making. So they would take these rocks, they would heat them up, and for Sati, they would line the bottom of a wooden vessel with branches from a local tree, and then they would mash in, do the wort, and that would be at a cold temperature, and then they would take these red hot rocks and drop them into the wort to heat up the wort. So you would go from, cold water temperature. Yeah, see there, we used redwood branches because we didn't have juniper trees here for this process. So we heated up the rocks, we put the mash in cold, and then we heated it up, and it went through your temperature rise, and eventually your mash out rise. And if you keep adding hot rocks, it actually begins to boil. So the farmers would do this method because they didn't have steel vessels to brew in. Everything was made of wood. So you can't put a wood kettle on on a fire, it'd catch on fire. So they would heat these rocks up and put them into the wooden vessel, heat up the mash, and it would go through the temperature rise. And at the top end of that, the beer would become pasteurized. It would become, sterile without bacteria because it gets warm enough, almost to boiling, to kill all the bacteria. They would then run that wort off and run it into wooden vessels to ferment it. So when we did this, you can see the pictures here. We used just that method. We heated up the rocks and put them in the mash and brought the wort up to temperature, no boil at all. So it's a raw beer. And we then took hops and mixed them in with the mash at the later end of heating it up. So we got some hop bitterness and some antimicrobial properties from that in this beer. And then we ran them off into, I think we used bourbon barrels for this beer, but they were already used to make bourbon barrel stout. So there wasn't much bourbon flavor in them. So we ran it off into these used barrels that were pretty flavor neutral. And we added Kveik yeast, which is from that area. And that's what they would have done to make a traditional sake. It would have been almost exactly that style. And there's a couple really good books out there on the history of these beers. One's called Brew Like a Viking.
Yeah, that one.
And there's another one by Lars. What's Lars's last name? Gaspo. I'm looking to see if I can see it over there. But his book is fabulous. I think it's called Farmhouse Brewing or some Farmhouse Brewing of.
Is it the one with the Kveik yeast ring on the cover page?
Yeah, I think it is. It came out about a year ago, and he was a blogger who took all his blogs together and combined them into the book. He's a very fascinating guy, very interesting, very smart. He's actually an engineer by trade, but he is a home brewer and kind of obsessed with this farmhouse style of brewing. So that was a very interesting beer. And we actually had a bar owner who wanted to buy half the batch. So he came out and brewed with us, and then he bought half the batch and sold it very quickly. And then we sold the rest at our pub, and it sold very quickly. So it's definitely another one that I think we're gonna do again. Although I gotta say, heating up that many rocks, it takes a long time. They have to get red hot, so it takes 3 or 4 hours in that
in the burn barrel, right?
Yeah, in the barrel to heat them up. So
got it. Yeah. So basically, if you're gonna go back a bit to a Stein beer, right? If you're gonna rebrew it again, you will apply this method of heating the hot rock and add it to the mash instead of to the kettle. Would that be done this way?
I think I would do both. I think I would add it to the mash because I think that's how it was traditionally done. And then I think that they probably use that method with the kettle as well. Either a wooden kettle or an actual metal kettle, depending on how far back you were. But I think they, used it in two separate parts of the process. So I would give that a try.
Yeah, cool. So by adding the hot rock for Stein beer, what does it do to the the content of the liquid that you add? Like, does it give a bit more the flavorful flavor?
I think that two things happen. One, the rocks are smoky. They're covered with smoke from the oak fire, so they lend a smoky flavor to the beer. Very light smokiness, not like a Rauch beer, but much more subtle. And they also, because they're so hot, there's a lot of caramelization that happens in the interface between the hot rock and the cooler wort. And I think that caramelization, some of it bleeds off into the flavor, so it has a more kind of richer toffee note to it as well.
Right. Interesting. I mean, adding hot rock to either the mash or the wort to boil itself sounds like a super, manly and medieval ways to brew, right? And yeah, it's also helped to promote all those caramelization. Seems to pair well with all sort of dark and brown style of beer to me. And from what I understand, this Stein beer is more about brewing practice rather than classifying what style of beer it is. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, I think so. It's
All
more
right,
about the
cool.
process than the real style because you'll see lighter versions and darker versions.
Hmm.
Um, I think you're right that the darker versions, you're already going to get some of those kind of caramely, toffee notes. And so the darker
Hmm.
malts kind of add to it.
Yeah, and for the one that is was brewed at Anderson Valley, is that a lager beer?
Yeah, we did lager that. And I think, most beer in Germany are lagers nowadays, even the darker ones.
Hmm.
So the one that Michael Jackson wrote about and the ones that I could find other, breweries reading about, they were doing lager beers. So we
Hmm.
stuck with a lager yeast. And I think that gives it a different, another level of being different from some of the other beers on this list. It's
Yeah.
the only real, lager.
Hmm. Hmm. Got it. Got it. Got it. All right. So we're gonna move on to the next one, and I hope that I pronounce this one right. Grodziskie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's close, I think. I don't know. I'm not Polish.
Yeah. And I heard that it's a Polish champagne from Groditz town in Poland.
Correct. Yes. I have had this beer, that particular brand, a few times and liked it quite a bit.
Hmm.
Um, I've also had one that there's a beer called a Lichtenheiner, which is similar to that, but it's also a little bit sour. So it's
Okay.
a kind of a combination of the two styles. But this beer is one that people are going to either love it or hate it. And
Okay.
unfortunately, most people didn't really like it that much. I think
Hmm.
any beer that is smoky is going to throw a lot of people that it's a flavor they're not expecting in beer. And this beer has a definite smoke character. Originally, I was going to get wheat malt and smoke it myself, but
Oh.
that's a whole lot of work. It would have been, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 days just to smoke the malt. And about 2 weeks before we were going to brew it, a friend of mine who I was talking to said, "Oh, well, Weyermann malt in
Hmm.
Germany, in Bamberg, Germany, they
Hmm.
make a beer, a malt just for making this beer. It's
Right.
a oak smoked wheat malt. Compared to the Rauch beer that is mostly made in that city
Hmm.
is, you know, not wheat malt but barley malt, and it's
Yes.
smoked over beechwood, which is a kind of a different flavor. But they were
Hmm.
also making this oak smoked wheat malt. So I just called them up and had them ship me, enough malt to do the batch.
Yeah. Right. So this Grodziskie is, you say, probably 100% oak smoke wheat malt. And what is the other process of making it, like normal brewing process?
It's a pretty normal brewing process.
Hmm.
We didn't do 100% wheat. We used, I think, 70% wheat, 30% barley. And
Hmm.
then wheat is a naked grain. It has no
Right.
husk to it.
Right.
So it can very easily form a real dense mash,
Yeah.
and your
Yeah.
runoff can be quite terrible and
Hmm.
take, 6
I
to
can
8
feel it.
hours.
I can feel it.
So we added a lot of rice hulls, which have no flavor, but they
Hmm.
build up the bed.
Hmm.
So it's like it adds, a lot of fluffiness to your mash bed, so you can actually do the runoff. And we use these rice hulls in any beer that has wheat in it now. They're super cheap, they're really effective, and our runoff was, just normal, like 90 minutes, which was much better than I expected because with 70% wheat, I really thought we'd have some problems.
All right. And how would you describe the flavor profile of the one that is brewed at Anderson Valley? Like oaky, smoky, fizzy,
I,
refreshing?
it smells like a campfire outdoors, and I like this beer, but I'm the only one at our brewery. Uh, I know a couple other people who like this. A guy down in San Jose who owns a bar, and he likes it. And he bought a 5-gallon keg from us, and he said he drank almost the entire thing because nobody else would drink it. So it's really a love or hate beer. You know, like maybe 5% of the people are going to love it, and the rest of them are going to try it and think, "Oh my God, why would you serve me ham in a glass?"
Right. And do you think like if you're gonna pair it with some sort of how would I say, like spicy herbaceous hop aroma, would that work together like more in a synergistic way, or would it clash? Just just toying the idea around.
I think, I made some bread with it the other day, and
Hmm.
that was very interesting. But I've never paired it with spicy food. I think that would be great.
Hmm.
It's very light. It's very effervescent. It's
Hmm.
supposed to be highly carbonated,
All right.
um, and the flavors are definitely, a lot of people, once they hear the ham reference, they can't get it out of their head. But I don't
Right.
really think it is very as much ham like it as it is like being outdoors at a camping ground.
Hmm.
There's that
Hmm.
kind of light, pervasive oak smoke aroma.
Right.
And I think it'd go great with spicy food. I'm gonna try that tonight.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
sure. Uh, I would say I think that the hoppiness level of the beer is pretty much low, right? It doesn't really interfere with the overall profile.
Yeah, it's fairly low.
Hmm.
We kept ours, in the 20 IBU range. I
Hmm.
think if you go too much lower, then it kind of feels flabby.
Right.
Um, Beer kind of needs hops to balance, but it
Hmm.
wasn't bitter and it wasn't aromatic. I think if I did it again, I might make it a little more bitter and use a little more aroma hops. But I'm pretty sure I'm never going to make this beer again because the guy who manages our warehouse, he's
Hmm.
like very unhappy that there's still like 8 kegs back there.
Okay, so this oaky, smoky, probably crispy and fizzy drinks, beer, it seems to be like a mysterious flavor profile and sounds fun to drink. So if the listener out there want to try this pretty unique one, just try to go find one or brew it yourself. Okay. The fifth one of this unfamiliar style, you've already touched probably half of the stories. It is the Finnish style sati, and you mentioned that it is one of the oldest style of beer there is, a famous farmhouse ale from Finland.
Yeah, I wish I could see the book.
Hmm. You
I
got it
don't know
around
where it
there?
is, but it's a fabulous book. Oh, wait, I see it. One moment.
All right, sure.
So when I was doing research for the Goza, I didn't know what I needed to read. So I just bought a lot of everything. But this
Hmm.
book,
Yeah.
this is fabulous book. Um, Lars has gone through and really done some awesome research, and he's taken a lot of really good, pictures, and it's in color, and he's gone
Hmm.
to dozens of farmhouses and talked with them about their brewing process, their particular brewing process. So that's a really good book. This is another good one.
The Viking
Brew
Brew.
Like a Viking.
Hmm.
Fascinating. It's not quite as fleshed out as Lars's book, but I think it has more technical advice.
Hmm.
So it's also quite good. There are a lot of Barbarian Beverage is also a pretty good book. There are a lot of good historical beer books out there. Um,
Yeah.
you just have to find them. Bookfinder.com can find any book for you pretty much. And then all you have to do is figure out how you're going to get it shipped to you.
Hmm.
But I knew very little about, most of these beer styles when I set out to discover them. So it took a
Hmm.
lot of reading and a lot of, talking to people who had brewed them. And sometimes I even got to talk to brewers who worked in breweries that had, contiguously brewed them, for hundreds of years. And So, each brewer brings their own kind of method to it. So in some of the areas where they brew sake, they actually bake a bread first, and then they
Okay.
crumble the bread up to, do a mash with.
Right.
And that seems like a lot of work. So I didn't go that far. But we did try to stick to it as traditionally as we could. And I've outlined kind of our process for that.
Hmm.
But if you're interested in beer history at all, those books are great. And this one in particular just has some really great history. And, it's, for me, it's kind of, our process is so different than it used to be. Now we use a lot of stainless steel, and everything's clean, and we don't want any bacteria, and there's no wood in the process. And it's just so very different than 1,000 years ago, where there was no stainless steel, there was no metal at all in the process.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, nothing was clean.
Hmm.
They used wooden vessels filled with bacteria. They used hot rocks that they dug out of the rocks.
Hmm.
Um, were usually just dug out of their fields as they, plowed the field. They're like, here's another rock. And I read an article that talked about how in that area, archaeologists had found these giant piles of rocks, and they just couldn't figure out where they'd come from or why they were piled up. And they all showed signs of being heated and then, spalling or, being heated and cracking. And they were mystified until one day, one of the archaeologists saw these guys brewing, and
Hmm.
he realized that these piles of rocks had been being built up over hundreds of years by that family that ran the farm. When one of
Hmm.
their rocks broke and couldn't be used anymore, they just hucked it out in this pile.
Right.
And it's interesting to think, how little we understood about a process that we're so familiar with, brewing, how different it was, 1,000 years ago, how little we know about that whole part of it.
Yeah, and this satay is one of the good example of those mysterious way to brew back then,
Yeah.
like past the Middle Age. So
And
yeah, please.
there's this picture here that
Hmm.
you talked about. This
Right,
is a
right.
wooden ring, and they come in different shapes and forms, and they're not always rings. Sometimes they're, X's or different things. And
Hmm.
the farmer would put this ring into the fermenting beer and let it sit, and then he'd pull it out and hang it on the wall, literally just hang it up. And what he, it has a lot of surface area on it, and the
Right.
yeast, when he pulled it out, would all stick to that, and he'd just hang it on the wall. And so the next batch would come along, he'd take the ring off the wall and he'd throw it into the wort. And as modern brewers, we hear this and think,
No,
no,
no, no. Right.
the beer would certainly be infected and horrible. But
Yeah.
this yeast strain is so strong, it outcompetes most bacteria. And so they were able to, brew like this for hundreds of years and make beer that probably, eventually, if you leave beer out, it all gets sour. No matter how careful you were in making it,
Hmm.
eventually bacteria will land on it if you leave it open. So those beers might have gotten sour as they were older, but apparently they weren't sour
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
of this, in the beginning anyway, because the yeast on those rings was so strong.
Hmm.
And you can buy
Interesting.
that yeast today. You can buy it now from a yeast broker.
Yeah, and that is Kavik yeast, right?
Yes.
Farmhouse, yeah, yeast from Finland and no, all those area around
Yeah,
Finland.
all of Scandinavia.
Yeah, and like you say that some of them would probably use the like bake bread first and then tear them into the small pieces
Hmm.
and use it to produce wort or some sort of source of food for the yeast itself. And they also use the malted barley as well, right?
Hmm.
In some area. And if I got this right, this one is a raw ale, so there's no boiling action. They're probably gonna heat it up somehow with the rock that you say.
Mm-hmm.
And one interesting point is that the style is so old that it predates the use of hops.
Yes.
So they are, I mean they use like the
Mm-hmm.
juniper bough or branch or berries that probably gonna possess some of this anti microbial growth in the same camp as what hop does for us. And and when drinking sati, what do we expect from it, like in terms of how should it taste? I could
I,
imagine.
I've never been to this region of the world. I would love to go.
Hmm.
It's on my bucket list. Um, and the satis that I have had have been very different. So
Hmm.
it sati is less a style of beer, I think, than a regional kind of term for
Hmm.
beer that's brewed in that area. It's they're all different. Um, but as you said, they don't use a lot of hops, even the
Hmm.
modern ones.
Yeah.
So they're not hoppy. They are often not very highly carbonated. So they're not still, but they're not fizzy. They're not really fizzy beers. They're often sweet because they don't have hops. They're often quite strong, 6 to 9%, somewhere in there. And
Hmm.
that adds to the kind of sweetness. So I think, we drink beer for very different reasons now.
Right.
Well, maybe not very different reasons, but in very different ways, I would say.
Hmm.
But people consume alcohol mostly because it makes them feel good.
Hmm.
And beer is, got the lowest amount of alcohol. So some people, like myself, and I think you, also enjoy the beer. They like the flavor, not just the impact. But
Hmm.
I like drinking beer even with very low alcohol. So I think for the sati beers, they were part of a tradition. So they drank them, you know, more for occasions than just every day. Although I'm
Hmm.
sure there's some people who drank it, daily. Um, and they're not really beers that you want to have every day. They're not light, crisp,
Hmm.
chuggable beers. They're much
Right.
more, substantial.
Hmm. And like from what you have described, it seems like you can expect like a broad spectrum of flavor profile for sati. Depends on the brewing ingredients, the way you brew it, and how you ferment it, and all kind of conditions. So it is it is probably like more like a localized flavor,
Yeah.
right? Okay, okay, interesting one, interesting one. Now, Fal, last but not least, the last style from the six examples that you gave is Bamberg style Rauch beer, where Rauch means smoke in German.
Yes.
Let's talk about it.
So this is a beer that I haven't brewed yet here at Anderson Valley. I've brewed it before uh,
Hmm.
at other breweries, but it's one of my favorite beers. But it's like the Grodziskie. It's a
Hmm.
smoked beer, so most people they're taken aback by it. And when I brewed it in the past, it hasn't sold very well in the U.S. So um, we have to get rid of the Grodziskie beer. We have to go through it all before I can brew this beer. So we're
Oh,
working on it, but my boss is like, "No, we're going to wait on this one." So
all right.
I love this beer, and there's a town in Germany called Bamberg, and
Hmm.
that's kind of the center, the epicenter for Rauch beer production. They have 9 breweries in this town, and it's a beautiful town. It didn't get bombed in World War II, so
Hmm.
it's all the historic buildings are still there. It has a river that runs through it, which it's just fabulously beautiful, and the whole town smells like smoky beer. And not all of the 9 breweries that are in Bamberg make a Rauch beer, but most of them make some form of it. There are 2 that are very well known, and they are Schlinkerla, the one that you have pictured. And there's
Yeah.
another beer called Fessla. It's a pub brewery, and they don't export much, so it's harder to find outside of that town. But those beers are usually have some color to it like this, although not always that dark. There are lighter versions, and they're made with this malt that is smoked over beechwood, which is they traditionally used beechwood to dry the malt. And as they dried it, it would pick up a lot of this smoky flavor. And I think it's a beer that is good by itself. It's good with food, certainly with meat or cheese or, those kinds of, heavy stews.
Rich. Yeah.
It's very rich and I think just fabulously delicious. Now, there are some people that would disagree.
Got it. Yeah. So smoked beer, rock beer from Bamberg. The main characteristic is gonna be this smokiness that what you mentioned. But if I understand this correctly, if it is well, formulated, well brewed, it's gonna not throw you off the bus that much, and you're probably gonna find yourself enjoying it, if you could. If you could.
Well,
So, yeah, to me, like, from my own experience, this is the style that requires an acquired taste. I mean, if you get it, you know what to expect, and you could appreciate its goodness. Yeah,
it
cool.
I think I recommend that anybody who loves beer go to Bamberg. And I don't want it to be overcrowded with geeky beer people, but it's not easy to get to, so it won't be overcrowded when people hear it. But if you're ever in Germany, it's worth a side trip to go to this town. It is, as I said, it's beautiful. The people are nice. The beers are fabulous. And there are 9 breweries, so you're not going to get bored. And you just go around to each of the 9 breweries, and it'll take you 2 or 3 days, or more if you stay a long time. They have good pubs there. But the first time you have one of these beers, you're going to be, as you said, a little shocked.
Right.
But your second one is going to be fabulous. And by the time you get to your third one, you'll be in love.
That's nice. That's nice. Yeah. So, like, given this, examples, I'm thirsty already, and it's all your fault. You're too good at describing these beers.
Well, you could have a nice, delicious Pilsner.
Oh yeah, of course. Oh yeah. I think I can find one here now, I guess.
I think you can. We started importing back or exporting to Thailand about 4 months ago, 5 months ago.
Yeah. Around that time. Yeah. So that's a great comeback.
Yeah. We're with on Beervana again. And they had a hard time during COVID. I think everyone did.
We all did. Okay, let's move forward. We're probably we are in the tail end of this session, so I'm gonna make like probably 3 rapid fire question to you about this unfamiliar style. So the first one is, from your experience, what are the feedback from customer when they get their hands on some of this unfamiliar styles that you brew at Anderson Valley?
It's been pretty broad response. Most customers who are craft beer drinkers who come to our pub, and that's mostly where we're selling these beers, they're excited about a new style, and they're open-minded mostly. So the response for most of them has been pretty good, but some of them are a little weird, like the Grodziskie or the Rauch beer. And I think, that those beers are just not going to be popular with everyone. And so I think if you're brewing a beer and going to be serving it to a broad spectrum of people, you probably want to make something that is a little tamer in this list, and has a little broader appeal. So the Koit beer was quite well received. The Sati that we made was quite well received. We kept ours at like 7% alcohol, so it wasn't overwhelming. And if you use a Kveik yeast, it is often quite dry. It ferments quite well. Sometimes the satis, I forgot to mention this, are made with bread yeast, which
Oh,
produces a lot of weird flavors. So some people can't, they don't want to accept the flavors when it's made with beer yeast. It's just too weird for them. So if
right.
it's made with a good yeast, like the Kvike yeast, I think, it can be quite drinkable and folks will like it.
Mhm.
What are some of the other ones we had? The Berliner Weiss can be quite
Yeah.
popular. People like those sorts of sour beers. We make a lot of them here at Anderson Valley, and we sell a lot of them. So those have a broad appeal, and that's a fun one to make.
Yeah. So most of them are in a positive side, I would say,
Yeah.
and that's gonna keep brewing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So yeah. Finger crossed. The next one is I like to ask you to look into these unfamiliar styles in terms of brewer perspective. As a veteran with several batches under your belt, what do you get or what do you learn from the brewing of these styles of beer?
I've learned a tremendous amount. I mean, as we discussed, I had just no idea how beer was brewed 1,000 years ago. So I learned a whole another method of making beer. And one of the things that it's taught me is that beer brewing is a very forgiving process. And I think as a professional brewer or even as a home brewer, you should really strive to be as clean as you can. I think that
Mhm.
makes better beer. But
Mhm.
I don't think you need to be as worried as I have been in the past about certain things. And you should open yourself up to kind of just letting things go and see where they go. Um,
All right.
Use a wild yeast, or do some crazy thing, or use an ingredient that's weird, and see how it turns out. Take a chance.
Mhm. 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 Awesome, awesome. And by talking to you now in this session, I think the Grodzisky is on my brewing wait list, and I need to expand my palate.
Okay, you were warned.
I'm
It's
warned. I'm warned.
I love that beer, and I love Rauch beer. I like smoky
Yeah.
things. So for me, it's not such a stretch, but there are quite a few people that, even brewers that work here, that were like, they tried it and they were just like, nah, not for me.
Nah, not my
But
thing.
you could probably find one in Thailand. I bet you there's some imported
Mhm.
there. And if you can find one and it's fresh or relatively fresh, it should be
Mhm.
pretty good. It should be a good example of what you could do at home.
Right. That's something that I have to look for it, and we'll see. We'll see how it works out. All right. We are coming to the close, and I'd like to end this session by addressing you this last question, Val. So, how do you find the future of these unfamiliar beer styles?
I'm hopeful. When I started off with this project, one of the reasons I wanted to do it was that I was tired of going to the pub
Mhm.
and seeing only IPA.
Mhm.
Now, I like IPA.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of IPA. But when I go in and you go into a bar and there are 9 IPAs, 2 dark beers, and a Pilsner, you're
Right.
like,
One.
yeah, I mean, like 9? That just seems like too many. So I
Mhm.
started brewing these to kind of expose myself and other people to the other things that are out there. And I think during that time period, not because of anything I did, but I just think that folks have come to the same conclusion that I did, that IPAs are great. I'd like to have 1 or 2, but I don't want to have all IPA all the time. And so they're coming in and looking for other things. Um, the thing that I love and don't love about IPA is the hoppiness. And I like hoppy beers, but if you have beers that are just so overwhelmed with hops, you might like one, but your second one, you can hardly taste anything because your palate's now been overwhelmed by all the hops. So
Yeah.
I think as we move away from those and get out into some of these more unusual beers, I think consumers and beer drinkers will begin to look for these more. And I think we're seeing that some already. So I'm hopeful that we'll find some more unusual beers out there. I think I was telling you before we started that I recently brewed a koji lager, and with koji rice. And I have high hopes for that beer. People seem to be very receptive, and it's light and drinkable, but has some flavors you're not going to find in other beers from the koji. So I think we keep experimenting, keep trying new things, and some of them are going to become fantastic. I mean, 20 years ago, most people never heard of an IPA.
Yeah.
30 years ago.
That's true, right?
Yeah. So look what happened there.
What happened to us now?
Yeah, I know, right?
Well, that's the great answer, Val. And do you have any final thoughts about this topic?
Well, I think, for the folks that are beer brewers out there, home brewers, professional brewers, don't be afraid. Experiment. Try new things. Try crazy things. Southeast Asia has zillions of flavors that we don't have here. So there's all kinds of things to experiment with. When I lived in Singapore, I made durian beer.
Yeah.
It was a lovely beer.
Crazy people.
So, you can try crazy things and somebody's going to like it. Some people may not like it, but, be bold. And I think for the consumers out there who aren't brewers, I think the same rule goes, is true. If you go into a pub and you see something unusual, give it a try. You don't have to order a whole pint. You can order a half pint or even ask them for a taste. But you're doing two things. One, you're exposing yourself to new flavors, and you might find something fantastic that you love. You're also supporting the brewer and his, search for new flavors. Because if nobody buys his experimental beer, then his boss is going to say, or her boss, they're going to say, you can't brew any more of that stuff because nobody drinks it. So as a consumer, try something unusual.
Yeah.
Take a chance.
Right. Give all the love, give all the love out there, right? Yeah. Okay, then. This is where we will leave the session. And Val, I have to thank you for your time coming to our platform and sharing us with all of these interesting and fascinating stories, as well as allowing us to peek behind the curtain of the brewing of these, unfamiliar styles at Anderson Valley Brewing Company. It means a lot. And, again, I cannot emphasize this enough that thank you for keeping, this unusual styles of beer alive and keep experimental things. Yeah, and this has inspired me and my friend and probably our listener too to do something about it.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you for having me. It's always good to see you. I hopefully we'll see you later this year or next year when we come out for Seabrew.
Okay. I'm just going to look forward to seeing you again in person sometime.
Yeah, I hope so.
In near future. Yeah. And probably that's all for today. And all right, Val, thank you and goodbye. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye. Well, folks, another wonderful session has passed, and I personally do not have much to add on. I know that several information like history side or in detail brewing process of these styles are left from this conversation, but this gives us opportunities to come back to it as an individual styles in future session if it is called for. So for today, the Good Burp session has to say goodbye, and we will be back in several weeks. So stay tuned. Until next time, cheers and สวัสดีครับ